Because it's 2015, those words spoken by Prime Minister Justin Trudeau explaining Canada's first federal cabinet where women held half of the posts. That same year in the UK, journalist Catherine Mayer co-founded a political party with sights on creating a world that's equal for all. She is president of the Women's Equality Party and the author, most recently, of Attack of the 50-Foot Woman, How Gender Equality Can Save the World. And we're pleased to welcome Catherine Mayer to our studio tonight. Welcome.
Thank you.
It's really nice to have you here.
Thank you.
So, you write that in 2015, you accidentally started a political party. Mm-hmm. How does one do that? What happened?
It literally was unplanned. It was in the run-up to the 2015 general election in the UK, and I went to an event at the South Bank Centre, and there were a lot of very wonderful women in politics, MPs, and a big audience, mostly women. And it should have been a sort of exciting occasion, and instead it was cloaked in gloom, because going into that election, many voters, but particularly women, felt that no party was speaking to them or for them, and people kept standing up and saying they weren't going to bother to vote at all. And of course, we're only going to be celebrating the centenary of votes for women in the UK in 2018. So
does it always shock you when you hear someone say, "I'm not going to vote"?
Yeah, it shocks me, and it's very sad. But particularly women, you know, we fought for this right, and there were all these women who were surrendering it again because they didn't think it was worth anything. And so I stood up and suggested that perhaps what we needed to do was to found a party that represented women better, that was a women's equality party. And I also suggested that we could take a leaf out of the UKIP playbook, because UKIP in the UK is a party that, in having this aggressively anti-Europe and anti-immigration platform, had begun to create seismic change. Of course, in the end, it led to Brexit.
But UKIP is also very polarizing.
It's very, very polarizing, but what it was a party that at its peak never had more than 2 MPs. And yet, because it was winning votes, because it looked electorally attractive, the old mainstream parties, instead of challenging its toxic views, were beginning to make themselves more and more like UKIP.
So they were morphing into UKIP.
And I thought, well, maybe we can use this in a kind of benign way. If we show that gender equality is a vote winner, maybe we can, you know, sort of persuade the older parties to change themselves and become more, to focus on this. And so I stood up and said that, but what I was not saying was, I am going to found a women's equality party. I was just saying maybe it would be a good idea. By the time I got home, social media had decided that I was proposing to found the party.
The next morning, before you went to bed, you made a post on Facebook.
That's right.
You wake up in the morning, and then there are all these people saying, I'm in, people that you know, people that you admire. At that point, did you think, I was just kidding? Why did you go through with it?
Well, it then got even funnier, because I have a very good friend who's a woman called Sandy Toksvig, who's well known in the UK as a broadcaster and comedian. And she and I had been talking some weeks previously about how disappointed we were to be in our 50s and find that the world had still not moved to gender equality, because, you know, we remembered being young women and being full of hope and thinking by now it would be long sorted. And so I rang her up to tell her what had happened. And instead of reacting as I expected, she said, but that's my idea. And I said, what do you mean? And she said, she had been planning for the very same festival that I'd been at with this women's event. She had been planning to showcase a sort of fantasy all-women government. And she said, I was about to ring you. Would you like to be Foreign Secretary, darling? So instead, we started talking and decided to give it a go. But we were also protected, I think, by our levels of ignorance of quite how difficult it was to do what we were proposing to do.
It's very expensive and very complicated to do.
Expensive, complicated, eats you alive, you know, takes over your life. But in a way, that's where naivety can be a helpful thing, because, you know, politics, and as with pretty much any area, is full of people who consider themselves experts, who will suck their teeth and tell you it can't be done that way. And, you know, in some cases, it's good to ignore the voices that say that.
What did you learn about yourself through that whole process?
Oh, My capacity for rushing in without thinking is probably unrivaled. But I don't know. I mean, I learned a lot of things. I learned that how much... It's been actually very interesting. A serious answer is that I learned how much I'd been repressing, how much of my own experience I had censored in order to make accommodation with the pretty sexist environments that I would routinely find myself in.
Well, you worked at The Economist and Time magazine, and in the book you describe your work this way. You enjoy access all areas, but that while the experience fosters understanding, they don't make you a part of the band. How do you think that experience helped inform your decision to form the Women's Equality Party?
Well, the experience of covering politics for 30 years absolutely informed the shape that we gave to the party and the idea of the party, which is a really unique political model. Because as a political journalist, you have to be non-partisan in your dealings with people. And most of us will come from one background or another where we're more inclined to be left-leaning or right-leaning or whatever it was. I had come from a very left-leaning background, but in having dealings with politicians right across the spectrum, it had helped me to understand that there were good politicians in all parties, that there were also bad politicians in all parties, but that there was a lot of common ground in theory around gender equality, and to already be thinking about, well, there's all this common ground and they're all signed up to it, but they're not doing it, so why is that? But it helped me understand the left tends to think that it owns gender equality. And if that were true, if it really took ownership, then we would be there already.
Because you're right that it's mostly on the right that we've had leaders from the right,
yes,
like May, Merkel, and Thatcher.
Yeah.
So if the left, that's one of the things that drives the party, why haven't we seen a woman leader from them?
Somebody jokes, and I repeat it in the book, that if the UK Labour Party were to hold an all-female leadership contest, that a man would still win the contest. That's harsh, but has been true for a long time.
What are they doing wrong?
And what it is, and this isn't just common. This is common to a lot of parties of the left, is that they're blinded by their own sense of their own virtue. Is because they have done some really good things for women. You know, their legacy is absolutely undoubted, but that legacy is limited, and it doesn't extend to sorting out their structural discrimination within their own ranks.
In fact, like taking a mirror to themselves.
Exactly.
And the Women's Equality Party is bipartisan, like you said, but the name itself was a bit controversial. How did you come up with the name?
Well, like most of the model and the name and the original core objectives were things that sort of sprang fully formed when we first started discussing it. I mean, you know, literally sort of sat and wrote this stuff on a napkin, and then started debating, and is this a good idea? And we did have a debate around the name. There were people who wanted us to call it the Equality Party. I mean, that was, again, quite ironic that the very first thing people were asking us to do was to drop the word women. And I think there would be many problems with calling it the Equality Party, not least that we were specifically there in order to address this issue of gender equality, this huge issue which actually impacts everyone. But nevertheless, you need a focus on it, and by removing that word, you would immediately lose that focus, and you'd get into that conversation about what kind of equality do you mean. But it was also because people were dissatisfied with the Labour Party, and they were sort of trying to do a reverse takeover of our new grouping to turn it into another form of Labour Party. I mean, I understood where they were coming from, but I'm very glad we stuck with our
and
stuck to our guns there.
The acronym is WE.
The acronym is great, and we have a wonderful logo with the WE, but the E is made into an equal sign. So again, I mean, some of this stuff, it felt like rather than us inventing things, like we were tapping into things that were already there.
And what are the pillars of the Women's Equality Party?
Well, we started with 6 core objectives and added a 7th. They are equal pay, as you would expect, equal representation, again, as you would expect in politics and business and working life, shared opportunities and responsibilities in parenting and caregiving. We also think it's very important to look at equality in and through education, because there's an awful lot that starts very, very early in development. Equality, equal treatment by and in the media, which as women in the media we would know something about, how very important it is to change that in order to move forward. And we also have always called for an end to violence against women and girls. And then we added a 7th core objective, which was equal health, because there are very uneven outcomes in healthcare and in medical research.
And you touch on all those topics in the book. Would this book be like a manifesto for the party?
It's actually much more than a manifesto for the party. I thought it was interesting to write about the party, to give insights into what it's like to found a party and to try and formulate policies to create gender equality. But it was really because a lot of these ideas are shareable way beyond the UK. And more than that, it was to bring together all of the arguments that I felt that women, and in fact anybody who believes in gender equality, would need anywhere in order to go forward with it. Because I looked for a book like this when we first started the party and I couldn't find one. So it's a bit like starting the party because there wasn't one that appealed. I wrote the book because I couldn't find the book that I was looking for.
Sophie Walker is the leader of the party.
Yeah.
Why aren't you leading it?
I didn't start the party as a platform for me, but very much to create space for other women to come through. But Sandy and I had a very funny conversation very early on. We like to get a couple of beers and sit in a bar and talk about what we intend to do. And we sat there and we said, you know, do you want to lead it? And she went, no. She asked me, do you want to lead it? No, we're too weird, aren't we? You know, and we're both in some ways too, you know, quite strange, but we're also...
That's okay.
We're also, you know, white middle-class media women, and, you know, this wasn't meant to be a party for you know, a small group of women. This was meant to be a party that reflected all the experiences, and we didn't think that either of us were the right people to lead it.
Well, you talk about intersectionality.
Yeah.
Why is that important when we talk about equality?
It's not just important, it's vital. It's because it's something, again, this has been a huge learning process. You know, it's so easy to be a sort of armchair politician when you're a journalist, and you look at people and you say, oh, well, if I'd do it like that, why aren't they doing it like that? And then when you're out there doing it, people ask you questions and you realise, you know, these things are quite tricky. And one of the first questions people were asking me is, what kind of equality are you aiming at? You know, is this an equality just for some women? Are you talking about making women more like men? Are you talking about moving some of the men out of the big corner offices and sticking women in big shoulder pads in those offices? Or are you talking about something more profound and far-reaching? And obviously, I always thought it was something much more profound and far-reaching. But you have to understand the experiences of women are so diverse, that women are so diverse, and that the disadvantages that women experience aren't just about being women, but they often intersect with other factors.
Like race, class, ability.
Exactly. And that if you ignore that, you're only going to be able to help some women. So that was, right from the beginning, something that we were addressing and were aware of, but also something that you understand very quickly. You know, it's very easy to sound like, you know, to sound well-intentioned, but to do the right thing is much harder.
You write that female leadership isn't necessarily free from the imperfections of the male variety. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think you only need look at the female leaders that there have been. You need only look at, for example, Theresa May, to see that women very often take as models for leadership the models that are already out there, but also that women are not, you know, I'm not assuming, I never started from the assumption that women were better than men or even necessarily were that different to men, though we have very different socialization. But and weirdly, one of the freedoms that women don't really enjoy is the freedom to fail, because so much is, there are so few women who actually make it into leadership roles. I mean, I crunched the numbers, as you'll know, because people kept saying, oh, there are so many female leaders these days. It's like, no, there are 144 full and partial democracies in the world, and we've actually got only 7.6% female leaders in the world. That is not many at all. And that scarcity means that we expect much more of them. We want some kind of perfection. We want them to lead in a different way. We want them in some way to bring some kind of more empathetic approach, like or whatever it is, softer, less warlike, greener, you know. And so one of the things I wanted to do in the book is look at female leadership where it does exist and figure out whether those traits or characteristics are a feature of it, and whether if you brought more women in, it would actually change the nature of leadership. And my feeling is, no, it probably wouldn't, but what it would do is it would infinitely broaden, or not infinitely, but by a huge amount broaden the talent pool, because you know, we're excluding women at the moment.
And the assumption is that once a woman is in a leadership position, she will advocate for women, but that's not always the case.
That's very much not always the case.
Why is that?
Well, again, I mean, a lot of the women who do break through have had to struggle in order to break through, and there is a syndrome that goes with that, which is the sort of, I did it by myself, and it will then devalue what I've done if I turn around and make it easier for the people who come after me. But also, I think a lot of women, you know, I said at the beginning that I'd realised how much I'd edited my own responses in order to just survive in the worlds I inhabited. I think a lot of women do what I did, and it's not that we ignore the issues or ignore other women, but it's that we shut down some of our own daily experience of discrimination, because otherwise we'd just spend the whole time being angry or crying or whatever it was.
Eating cake.
and so in a way, you often see with female leaders that they don't want to be identified as, they don't want to be associated with so-called women's issues, because they think that that will in some way devalue or weaken their brand.
And you also say that women's issues are men's issues.
They absolutely are, yeah.
How do you mean? What do you mean?
Well, I mean, it's one of the main reasons that we are where we are with no single country in the world gender equal is because men don't understand the fact that most of the issues that get dismissed and belittled as women's issues are actually people issues. I mean, think about parenting, for example. The number of times you hear it talked about as if it was only women that had children. And, you know, you hear people, when even sort of enlightened parents, where you'll hear the father accidentally refer to looking after his own kids as babysitting, you know, but on a much more serious basis, in terms of economics, in terms of policy making, the failure to take women and women's perspectives into consideration actually makes for much worse policies with much worse outcomes, not just for women but for men too. And so in deciding that anything that involves women is a side issue, men are actually harming themselves and diminishing the benefits that we could all be sharing in.
How do you convince men of that?
It's a really good question, and when you've got the answer, you tell me. I've been, going completely mad recently because I have been doing this book tour with this book around the UK, and men keep running up to me going, "I bought your book." And I think, great. And then they go, "For my wife." And
that's not the point.
And I sort of like find myself saying through gritted teeth, "Read it yourselves."
You also mentioned parenthood, and you write that as much as change is still the expectation that all women want to become mothers. You write, "I worry that the mystification of motherhood dupes women into accepting the maternity penalty as the price of entry to the club." Yeah. What do you mean by that?
Well, it's very complicated attitudes to motherhood and maternity, and but it is very clear that there is a kind of mystification around it, that it is the purest emotion that you can have, and that there is also a notion that women cannot really be complete until they have children, and you find that other women will impose these ideas on you and will really not want to relinquish some aspects of that idea, because there's so little that women are allowed to have ownership of themselves. So they defend it quite vigorously, and it just worries me that it's not to say that you know, motherhood isn't a wonderful thing, because it is, but it's that to mystify it is to feed into this notion of it being an essential to, as I say, to being part of the female experience.
And I think too that women who decide not to have children kind of get, I mean, it's a conversation that people don't really have, but when they do have it, it's like, oh, something's wrong with you, as if it's like a, you know, why aren't you a mother?
There have been some incredible attacks on childless female politicians for that very reason. Angela Merkel, one of the things that happened in her early days in power was that there were all sorts of nasty cartoons about empty cradles and sort of ideas of her being in some way deficient in understanding because she had not had children herself. Now that she's so popular, they have they call her Mutti. Her nickname is Mutti, mother.
Mother.
Yeah. So she's become
the mother of the country.
The mother of the country. So now they can accept her.
The last chapter of your book, the reader is introduced to the fictional land of Equalia. Am I saying it right?
Well, you are saying it right as far as I had it in my mind.
Okay, good.
The BBC corrected my own pronunciation of it recently and told me it was Equalia.
Okay, well, I'm glad I got it right. And in Equalia, gender equality is recognized as being better for everyone. How hopeful are you that it will become a reality one day?
I'm optimistic about it, and I'm optimistic. It may seem very strange to be optimistic at this point in time, where in many ways you see the rights and protections enjoyed by women under siege worldwide. There is so much turbulence, not just in Trump's America and in Europe with the rise of populism, but really everywhere. But in that turbulence, there is also opportunity, because all of the great breakthroughs for women have been at times of turbulence. You know, if you look at what happened with women after, for example, the First and Second World Wars, those were periods of great change, but also then backlash. So what we've got to do is sort of seize the moment and then guard against that backlash.
And in the book, you write about Iceland.
Yes.
Why is Iceland so special?
It was really an interesting thing for me, because I knew about it, but I had not travelled there until I went there to research the book, and I assumed that Iceland had topped the gender equality tables for 7 years because the women were feminists. We have an amazing head of policy at the Women's Equality Party called Hadla Gunnarsdottir, who is had worked in the government that came in after the Icelandic financial crash, and the women-led government that then actually kind of pulled Iceland out of the crisis and sorted things out. And Hadla is wonderful, but she is very typical in some ways of her compatriots, in that she never sort of softens the edge of her sentences, and she's incredibly direct, and you sort of think, well, no wonder they're so they're so good at doing this because they haven't learned deference in the way that women are so often taught it in other cultures. But when I got there, I realised that it was much more profound than that. It was that Icelandic men are feminists too, and that they understand exactly the point we were discussing before, that gender equality is something that is in their interests, and they no longer see things that get dismissed as women's issues. They understand they're their issues. And it all goes back to one day in 1975 when 90% of Icelandic women took the day off from their paid and unpaid duties as a kind of festive protest. And it made the men sort of sit up and realise how much women contribute.
And you're planning one for 2018?
Yep.
A British day off?
Yeah. Aiming to do it, has to be very inclusive, has to be very carefully organised so that exactly the women that are most in need of help are not instead inconvenienced by it, because of course, you know, women do more caring, for example. So asking women to leave unpaid caring duties, it's then who does that, what happens to the people who need the care and all of that. So we're working very hard to make sure that it can be a big and inclusive and really something, again, that will make visible what's invisible and work as a piece of advocacy to win everybody over to this idea that is so important, and there's so much evidence for it, which is that gender equality is better for everyone, men included.
Catherine, thank you so much for being here. Great book.
Thank you.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.